I met Julia on a quiet winter evening, when the snow had covered the city in a blanket of pure white. The lights from the street lamps cast a soft, warm glow on her face as she stood by the cafe window. Something in her gaze, something unspeakably sad, drew me in. I never believed in fate before, but in that moment, it felt as if I'd known her my entire life. The way her eyes looked out, as if searching for something, or someone, was enough to draw me in like a moth to flame. We didn't just fall in love. No, it was more than that, it was an all-consuming need. She became my whole world, my everything. I wasn't a wealthy man, but whatever I had, I wanted to share with her. We moved quickly, and before long, our lives were inextricably intertwined. Marriage came naturally, as did the deep trust that bound us. I wasn't just her husband, I was her protector, her rock. In every way possible, I gave myself over to her. I signed the house in her name, let her handle our finances, and entrusted her with every penny I'd earned. Some people would call me naive. Maybe even reckless, but for me, this was love. It wasn't just money, it was a symbol of my devotion, of the promise I'd made to her that we would always be together, no matter what. For a while, life felt perfect. I'd come home each evening to her smile, to the scent of dinner wafting through the air, to the warmth of her embrace. She was my partner, my confidant, my everything. I never questioned her, why would I? Julia was my wife. I had given her my entire heart, and I believed she had done the same. I didn't see the cracks at first, or maybe I didn't want to. They started as small things, innocent enough to ignore. There were nights when she would come home later than usual, brushing off my questions with a gentle kiss and a soft reassurance. Just work, she'd say, her eyes holding a hint of something I couldn't quite read. Her late nights became more frequent, but I told myself I was overthinking. The trust one had in Julia was unshakable, so I dismissed my doubts as insecurity. She had done so much for us, for me, and I knew she was just trying to make our lives better. But there was one night, one particularly cold evening in December, that planted the first real seeds of doubt. I remember sitting by the window, watching the snow pile up on the streets, waiting for her to come home. Midnight passed, and then 1 o'clock. She didn't answer her phone, and I felt my chest tighten with a strange mixture of worry and suspicion. When she finally walked through the door in the early hours of the morning, her hair slightly disheveled, I saw something in her eyes that made my heart sink. She was different, distant, as if she'd become a stranger in the time she'd been away. When I asked her where she'd been, she simply smiled, that mysterious smile I'd once fallen in love with, and assured me it was just a work thing. Despite my unease, I let it go. How could I not? She was my wife, and I loved her with every part of me. I didn't want to see the darkness that had started to creep into our lives. As the days passed, I told myself that it was all in my head. I convinced myself that our love was stronger than any fleeting doubts. In the end, love requires trust, doesn't it? And so I buried my suspicions deep, hoping that whatever this feeling was would pass like a winter chill. Little did I know, the foundation of my life was already beginning to crumble. But I held on, as I always did, believing that our happiness was eternal, that Julia and I were meant to be together, forever. Life moved forward, though my heart grew uneasy. The silences between Julia and me became louder. I tried to ignore them, to carry on with our routine, and for a while, I managed. But the doubt lingered, whispering its terrible possibilities late at night, when I'd lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the empty space beside me in bed. One evening, after another long day at work, I returned home to find Julia already dressed, preparing to leave. She looked beautiful, too beautiful, in fact, for what she'd said was just another night of business meetings. Her dress was dark, fitted perfectly to her frame, her hair done up in a way that I'd only seen on special occasions. "Are you going somewhere nice?" I asked, hoping she'd tell me she was meeting friends, maybe going to dinner with colleagues. Just a hint of what I'd started to fear might not be true. Just work, she replied, not quite meeting my eyes. Her tone was so casual, as if there was nothing at all strange about leaving at 8 in the evening for a work meeting in a dress that seemed fit for a night on the town. My stomach tightened. "I'll wait up," I murmured, half hoping that she'd change her mind, but she simply flashed me that same enigmatic smile and closed the door behind her. That night, I waited until 1, then 2 in the morning. My phone remained silent, and so did hers. In the dark, every small sound, the hum of the heater, the ticking of the wall clock, became louder, each second of her absence stretching into an eternity. I didn't want to suspect her, didn't want to be the husband who questioned his wife. But as the hours dragged on, doubt took root, spreading like an insidious vine wrapping around my heart, squeezing it in an unforgiving grip. By the time Julia came home, the first light of dawn had begun to creep through the window. She entered quietly, as if trying not to wake me, though she must have known I'd stayed up waiting. Her smile faded when she saw me sitting there, my face weary, my heart aching in silence. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice soft but not apologetic. I wanted to ask her where she'd been, who she was with. But looking at her then, I knew I couldn't handle her answer if it was what I feared. Instead, I forced a smile, a hollow, painful smile. "Just worried about you," I whispered, hoping she'd see the longing in my eyes, the desperation that I felt for her to give me a reason to believe in her again. She gave me a quick kiss, and without a word, went to bed, leaving me alone in the empty living room with my unanswered questions. In the days that followed, the unease between us deepened. She'd disappear without explanation, her phone mysteriously out of reach for hours at a time. I knew I should confront her, demand to know the truth. But each time I tried, the words would die on my lips, smothered by my fear of what she might say. It wasn't just love that kept me silent, it was something darker, something rooted in my own insecurities. If I acknowledged the possibility that Julia was betraying me, what would that make me? A fool? A failure? The truth loomed before me like a chasm, but I couldn't bring myself to look into its depths. The turning point came late one evening. I'd returned home early, hoping to surprise her. Maybe rekindle the warmth that had somehow slipped away. I walked through the door and immediately sensed something was off. Julia wasn't there, though I knew she hadn't mentioned going out that night. I picked up my phone, scrolling through the messages, searching for any hint of where she might be. And then, something caught my eye, a message she'd sent earlier that week, a simple reminder that she had another late meeting. But the wording felt odd, as though it wasn't meant for me. I knew then that I couldn't pretend any longer. Driven by an impulse I couldn't control, I left the house, letting my instincts guide me. I don't know what I expected to find, perhaps some harmless explanation that would make me laugh at my own foolishness. But as I turned the corner to the place where her meetings supposedly took place, I saw her, standing outside a small, dimly lit restaurant with a man I'd never seen before. They were close, their heads tilted toward one another, their hands touching. A part of me wanted to call out her name, but my voice was caught in my throat, strangled by shock and betrayal. I couldn't move, couldn't think. The world around me blurred, and for that moment, all I could feel was the unbearable weight of the truth I had fought so hard to deny. I stood there, rooted to the spot, watching as they disappeared into the restaurant together. My mind raced, yet I couldn't bring myself to follow. Instead, I turned away, my heart shattered, feeling as though every piece of me had been stripped bare. That night, I returned home and waited for her as I had so many nights before. She came back much later, wearing that same unreadable expression, giving me that same half-hearted smile as if nothing had happened. But this time, I didn't ask where she'd been. I no longer needed to. I knew, and the knowledge left me empty, a hollowed-out version of the man I once was. I went to bed alone, lying awake in the dark, grappling with the painful truth. Julia wasn't just slipping away from me, she was already gone. After that night, nothing was the same. I existed in a state of numbness, drifting through each day as if watching my life unfold from a distance. Julia continued to leave at odd hours, her lies now painfully obvious to me. The words I'd once trusted with all my heart had turned into cruel barbs that twisted deeper with every false "I love you" or fleeting kiss goodbye. Days blurred into one another, and I withdrew into myself, pretending not to notice as my world unraveled. My mind went to dark places, to all the things I'd ignored. I began questioning every moment, wondering what was real and what had been fabricated. I could barely bring myself to look at her. When she'd catch me staring, she'd give me that same unreadable smile, a look that made my skin crawl. But even in the midst of all this pain, I still couldn't let her go. Somewhere in my shattered heart, I held on to a shred of hope, a desperate wish that things could somehow return to the way they once were. It was this foolish hope that kept me from confronting her, from demanding the truth. And in that silence, the storm only grew. Then, one morning, everything changed. It started with a knock at the door, a sharp, almost urgent sound that sliced through the silence. When I opened it, I was met by a man in a suit, holding a stack of documents that he placed in my hands without a word. I stared down at the papers, confusion giving way to shock as I scanned the words in front of me. My hands trembled. Each line was like a dagger to the heart: notice of foreclosure, outstanding debt, final demand for payment. It seemed impossible, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I'd been careful, saved every dollar, and ensured that Julia and I lived within our means. But as I read further, the horrible truth became undeniable. Julia had been siphoning our money for months, if not years. She'd taken out loans in my name, drained our accounts, and left us with nothing. The house, our house, the one I'd worked so hard for, was no longer ours. The life I'd built, the safety I thought I'd secured, was gone. She'd gambled it all away, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but debt and ruin. That evening, I waited for her return, my heart a mixture of rage, sorrow, and betrayal so deep I couldn't find the words to express it. When she finally walked through the door, still radiating that same composed indifference, something inside me snapped. I held the documents up to her, my voice shaking. "Did you think I wouldn't find out?" She stared at me, eyes widening only slightly, as if caught off guard but unwilling to admit fault. "David, I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her tone clipped, almost dismissive. Her lie only fueled my anger. "The loans, Julia. The house. The debt." My voice broke, and the pain of betrayal erupted, spilling out in a torrent of accusations I'd bottled up for so long. She met my gaze, her expression one of cold detachment. "It was just money, David. Don't be so dramatic. Just money." Those words struck me like a punch to the gut. The love we'd shared, the trust I'd given her, everything she'd taken was so much more than just money. It was my life, my heart, everything I had given her freely. And now, seeing her standing there, unrepentant, indifferent, I felt something inside me shatter irreparably. Julia left that night, without so much as a backward glance. I didn't stop her. There was nothing left to say. I watched her walk away, her silhouette disappearing into the night, and knew that whatever had once bound us together was gone. The woman I'd loved, the person I thought I'd build a future with, had left me nothing but empty rooms and a heavy weight of debt crushing down on me. Over the next few days, I began the grim task of sorting through the wreckage she'd left behind. The bank called with its demands, each conversation a fresh reminder of how much I'd lost. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years reached out, offering condolences and empty promises of help. But nothing could erase the hollow ache that gnawed at me, a pain born not just of financial ruin but of the deeper betrayal that cut through every part of my soul. The following months were a haze of hard choices and harder truths. I sold everything I could, scraping together whatever was left to keep myself afloat. I took on extra work, long shifts, anything to pay down the debts that Julia had left in her wake. The house, the car, even the wedding ring I'd once cherished, it all went, piece by piece, until I was left with nothing but the clothes on my back and a bitter sense of loss. I found a small apartment on the edge of town, barely more than a room, but it was mine. I spent my days working, my nights lying awake, haunted by memories of a life that no longer existed. The love I'd believed in, the future I'd dreamed of, it was all a lie, and the realization weighed on me, a constant reminder of the price I'd paid for trusting too blindly. But as time passed, the pain dulled, replaced by a steely resolve. I knew I could never go back, never reclaim the life I'd lost. But perhaps, in some small way, I could rebuild, start over, and find a way to move forward. In the months that followed Julia's departure, I found myself confronting a new, harsh reality. Every morning, I'd wake up to the sound of traffic outside my small apartment window, the once familiar sounds now serving as a reminder of how drastically my life had changed. Gone were the quiet suburban streets and the warmth of our home, I was left with little more than four cold walls and the echoes of what once was. I went to work each day, the monotonous routine becoming a strange sort of comfort. I picked up extra shifts, often working well into the night, throwing myself into every task, no matter how small. I knew it wouldn't erase the debt overnight, but every hour, every dollar, brought me a step closer to stability. Still, there were nights when the emptiness crept in, filling the silence with painful memories. I'd sit by the window, watching the lights flicker across the city, wondering how I could have missed all the signs. The ache was still there, a deep scar that no amount of hard work could cover. But amidst the pain, I began to feel something else, something quiet but strong, a sense of resilience, of determination to move forward. One day, while clearing out the last of my belongings, I stumbled upon an old notebook, one I'd kept back in college. It was filled with sketches, half-finished poems, and pieces of writing I'd done in my free time. I'd once dreamed of being a writer, of telling stories that would resonate with others. But somewhere along the way, life had gotten in the way, and I'd set those dreams aside. As I flipped through the pages, I felt a pang of longing, a spark of something I hadn't felt in years. Perhaps it was time to reclaim that part of myself, to find solace in creation rather than dwelling on destruction. I started writing again, pouring my pain and loss into words, letting each sentence bring me a small measure of relief. It became my sanctuary, a place where I could process the storm of emotions inside me without fear of judgment. In those quiet hours, I began to see that my story wasn't over, it was simply changing course. Writing became a way to reimagine my pain, to transform it into something meaningful. The stories I crafted weren't just about loss, they were about resilience, about survival in the face of heartbreak. I wrote as if my life depended on it, and perhaps, in some ways, it did. One evening, I received a message from an old friend, Emily. She'd heard about what had happened and reached out to offer her support. We hadn't spoken in years, but something in her voice, her kindness, brought a comfort I hadn't felt in a long time. Emily had been a friend from college, someone who knew me before life had chipped away at my dreams and hardened my heart. We started meeting for coffee now and then, our conversations light at first, but gradually deepening as I found myself opening up to her in ways I hadn't with anyone else. Emily listened without judgment, offering quiet encouragement without prying into details I wasn't ready to share. In time, I confided in her about Julia, the betrayal, the financial ruin. Emily didn't offer empty platitudes or tell me everything would be okay, she simply listened, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of my emotions. She reminded me of the person I'd once been, of the dreams I'd held close to my heart before they were overshadowed by Julia's lies. With Emily's support and my writing as an outlet, I felt the darkness begin to lift, slowly but steadily. My focus shifted from the pain of what I'd lost to the possibilities that lay ahead. I still had my share of lonely nights, the memories of Julia's betrayal lingering like an old wound, but each day became a little easier. The anger, the heartbreak, they became part of my story, but not the whole of it. One evening, Emily and I were walking through the park, the city lights casting a soft glow over the landscape. She turned to me, her eyes thoughtful. "David, have you ever thought about publishing your writing?" she asked, her voice gentle yet insistent. The idea had crossed my mind, but I'd dismissed it as a distant fantasy. But seeing the sincerity in her gaze, I felt a flicker of courage, a belief that maybe, just maybe, my words could find a place in the world. With her encouragement, I started submitting my work, each rejection a reminder of my resilience, each small success a beacon of hope. Months turned into a year, and the remnants of my old life gradually faded into memory. I continued to work, to write, to rebuild. My debts weren't fully paid off, but I'd made enough progress to breathe easier, to see a future beyond the burdens Julia had left behind. Emily and I grew closer, our friendship blossoming into something deeper, something I hadn't expected but found myself embracing. She became my confidant, my partner, someone who knew my brokenness but accepted it, not as a flaw, but as part of who I was. Her kindness reminded me that love could be gentle, that trust didn't have to be given blindly but could be built slowly, one step at a time. As I stood on the edge of this new life, I realized that Julia's betrayal, as painful as it had been, no longer defined me. I was more than the heartbreak, more than the loss. I was a man who had survived, who had found strength in the wreckage and courage in the uncertainty. The scars would remain, a testament to the journey I'd endured, but they no longer held me captive. A year had passed since Julia's departure, and with it, the storm in my life had settled. The winds of loss, anger, and betrayal still lingered at the edges of my days, but they no longer controlled me. I had found the courage to face them, not by running away, but by allowing myself to feel each emotion, each moment, and letting go when it was time. The apartment, once a symbol of my defeat, had become a sanctuary, a place where I could breathe and rebuild. The small desk in the corner, where I once sat and struggled with the weight of my pain, was now my place of creation. The stories I wrote had evolved, they were no longer just about loss or heartache, they had become about redemption, about discovering beauty in brokenness, about the possibility of starting anew. My writing had found a home in the world, small literary magazines at first, then eventually, a book deal that I never imagined would come. But even as I saw the recognition begin to trickle in, something deeper had changed inside me. I no longer needed validation from the outside world. I had come to understand that my worth wasn't defined by the scars I carried or the failures I had endured. It was defined by how I chose to live, how I chose to rise, and the strength I found in the quiet moments of self-reflection. One rainy afternoon, as I sat by the window watching the gray sky pour down, Emily came over, as she often did. We spent our usual time together, talking, laughing, and sharing the small moments of our days. But today, there was a shift in the air. It wasn't just the weather, it was something between us, something unspoken that I couldn't ignore. We had become close, inseparable even, but there was a distance now, a silent acknowledgement of the way our relationship had evolved. I had begun to see Emily in a new light, not just as a friend, but as something more, someone who had been there for me in ways I never thought possible. She had witnessed my darkest days, yet here she was, standing by me as I slowly but surely pieced myself back together. "David, there's something I've been meaning to say," Emily began, her voice hesitant, almost nervous. She looked out the window, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup as if searching for the right words. I didn't know what to expect, but I could feel the weight of her words, the gravity of the moment. I set my pen down, focusing entirely on her. "What's on your mind?" She turned to face me, her eyes steady and sure, yet soft. "You've been through so much. I've watched you heal, watched you become a person I always knew you were inside. But I need to ask you something, and you don't have to answer right away, okay?" Her voice softened even more. "Have you thought about us? About what could be between us?" The question hung in the air, heavy and vulnerable. I was stunned for a moment, unsure how to respond. But then, the truth became clear to me. I had been so consumed with the past, with the wounds that Julia had left behind, that I had never allowed myself to truly consider what the future might look like, what this might look like. I took a deep breath, my heart open but cautious. I've been afraid, Emily. Afraid of opening up again, of trusting. But I think I'm ready. For something real. With you. Her smile, the kind that reached her eyes, was enough to reassure me that this was the beginning of something new, something different. And for the first time in a long while, I felt the weight of the past lift, just a little. The days that followed were filled with a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced in years. Emily and I began to navigate this new chapter of our relationship, not rushing, but letting it unfold naturally. We still had our quiet moments of reflection. She, too, had her own battles, her own wounds, but we faced them together, side by side. In many ways, I realized that healing wasn't a destination. It was a journey, one that didn't end when the scars faded. It continued with each new step we took, with each new experience we shared. There were still moments of uncertainty, moments when I wondered if the ghosts of my past would ever truly leave me. But I had learned that I didn't need to let them define me any longer. Emily and I built something different from what I had with Julia. It was built on honesty, respect, and the understanding that love, real love, takes time. It wasn't a fairy tale, but it was something real, a bond forged in the fires of hardship, tested by the weight of our own histories, but unbreakable nonetheless. One evening, as the sun set behind the city skyline, I sat at my desk and penned the last words of my first novel. It had taken me months, but it was done. I felt a deep sense of accomplishment, not just because the book was finished, but because it symbolized my journey, my ability to move forward. The pain, the heartache, it was all in there, woven into the pages, but so was the healing, the hope, and the strength to overcome. As I sat back, reflecting on the journey I'd taken, I thought about Julia. I had spent so long angry with her, bitter over everything she had taken from me. But now, I realized that my healing wasn't about her, or even about the betrayal. It was about me. It was about how I chose to rise from the ashes, how I chose to rebuild and reclaim the pieces of myself I thought I had lost. Julia's betrayal had taught me many things, but the greatest lesson of all was this: I was more than what had happened to me. I was more than my scars. I was the person I had become in spite of them. And with that realization, I was free.